Welcome to Immigration Quicktake. This is Ellie Rutledge Silver with the American Immigration Lawyers Association. Last week, a coalition of civil rights groups reached an agreement with the state of Arizona on the enforcement of the most contentious section of Arizona's Senate Bill 1070. Here to share more is Greg Chen, AILA's Director of Advocacy. Greg, thanks for joining me. What was SB 1070?
SB 1070 was a law that was enacted in 2010 in Arizona, and it quickly became notorious nationwide for authorizing, even mandating, illegal, unlawful practices by local police to conduct racial profiling and to arrest individuals on suspicion of being undocumented. The law had several components of it, the most notorious of which was called the Show Me Your Papers provision, and it essentially required the local law enforcement in Arizona to stop and detain individuals on reasonable suspicion that they might not have papers, legal presence to stay in the United States. The law also had some other components that criminalized certain behavior by individuals who were undocumented, including somebody not carrying their papers became a crime, as well as somebody who might seek work while being undocumented. The historical context to SB 1070 was very important. It ushered in, first of all, a slew of other very negative racial profiling-oriented laws across the country in other states. And civil rights groups, immigration organizations, and AILA decried it for the kinds of practices it condoned and even required of local law enforcement. And it also is a law that exists in the context of Sheriff Joe Arpaio, somebody who was well known in state as a sheriff who demanded from his officers this kind of unlawful behavior. In 2012, a long process of litigation against SB 1070 came to an initial close with the Supreme Court ruling that certain elements of that law were not going to be allowed to stand. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court did not rule on the particular racial profiling provision and allowed that to stand.
What does this agreement do?
With the settlement agreement reached by the litigants in the case, the Arizona Attorney General has now issued an opinion providing instruction on how SB 1070 should be implemented and enforced. Most importantly now, the Arizona Attorney General has said that local law enforcement cannot stop individuals based on their race or ethnicity to form the reasonable suspicion for the purposes of a stop. Secondly, the aspect of the law that would have allowed individuals to be detained solely for the purpose of their immigration status will not be enforced. So we are now in a place, after all these years, that somebody will no longer need to be concerned that they will be stopped on their immigration status alone. And lastly, somebody cannot have their stop by a law enforcement officer prolonged solely for the purpose of investigating their immigration status. Those are the three really key and important provisions of what are going to be different now moving forward after the Attorney General's opinion. Lastly, though, officers still can ask about immigration status. They're simply not required to, as the state law formerly had in its provisions, but they can still ask those questions of individuals.
What happens now?
Moving forward, there's both a small picture and a big picture question. At the smaller level, the important question is going to be, how will this law actually be implemented now? What kind of training is going to be given to the officers on the ground in Arizona to make sure the Arizona Attorney General's opinion actually is put into effect and done properly? A lot of monitoring will need to be done. Civil rights groups, immigration groups are going to need to make sure that racial profiling doesn't still happen in state. The bigger picture is that we have now brought an end to this misguided law. We've brought to an end this very ugly period in Arizona's history, commanded by the public attention that Sheriff Joe Arpaio has drawn to the kinds of unlawful, illegal practices of racial profiling and targeting, really, of not just people who are undocumented, but really to immigrant communities across the state. And we've also seen now upheld the notion of that civil rights will be protected in the state of Arizona, and I certainly hope that message will be sent across the country to states nationwide, to law enforcement officers nationwide, that the laws of all individuals, the rights of all individuals, will be protected under the law.
Thanks, Greg, for joining me. For the rest of you, please stay tuned for more updates from the American Immigration Lawyers Association.